Imagine a time when the world was on the brink of a new golden age. Europe in the 14th century was a place of burgeoning trade, of grand cathedrals, and of a population that was steadily expanding. But then, a shadow fell. A microscopic killer arrived, carried by fleas on the backs of rats, and swept across the continent with a ferocity that seemed to defy the natural world. It was the Black Death, a pandemic that wiped out an estimated one-third of Europe's population in just a few short years. It was a singular, catastrophic event that changed the course of history, shaking the foundations of society, economy, and religion. But what if that shadow never fell? What if the rats carrying the plague were stopped at the docks? What if a different, less deadly strain was all that arrived? What if, for whatever reason, the Black Death never happened? This isn't a simple tale of a world without suffering. It's a deep dive into the profound and transformative consequences of a different kind of Europe, one that was never haunted by the specter of a great dying. This is a story of a world that was never reset by the plague. Part 1: The demographic boom and the collapse of feudalism. The most immediate and dramatic consequence of a world without the Black Death would be a sustained and explosive demographic boom. In our timeline, the plague wiped out so many people that it created a massive labor shortage. The feudal system, which was based on a large peasant class tied to the land, crumbled. Serfs who survived the plague found they had newfound leverage. They could demand higher wages and better working conditions. In a world without the plague, that power dynamic never shifts. The population would continue to grow, leading to an excess of labor. This would have a crushing effect on the working class. With too many people competing for too few jobs, wages would stagnate or even decrease. Landowners and nobles would hold even more power, and the feudal system would likely persist for centuries longer than it did in our timeline. The social structure of the Middle Ages, with its rigid hierarchy, would be cemented in place. There would be no widespread peasant revolts, no sudden shift in power from the lords to the common people. The world would be more crowded, more stable, and far more stagnant. Part 2: The stagnation of culture and knowledge. The Renaissance, a period of unprecedented cultural and intellectual rebirth, was a direct result of the plague. The sudden collapse of the social order created an intellectual vacuum. People began to question the old ways of thinking, the old religious dogmas, and the authority of the church. The art of the Renaissance, with its focus on humanism, was a response to a world where a loving God seemed absent. Without this societal trauma, the intellectual ferment that led to the Renaissance would be absent. Universities would remain exclusive institutions for the elite, and the knowledge they held would be guarded, not shared. There would be no popular interest in art and literature, as the masses would be too preoccupied with survival. The great works of men like Shakespeare and Leonardo da Vinci might still exist, but their genius would be a niche, regional phenomenon, not a global revolution. The rigid social order would lead to a rigid intellectual one, where tradition is valued over innovation, and where new ideas are seen as a threat to the established order. The world would be culturally poorer, clinging to its past rather than building a new future. Part 3: The unchecked power of the church. In our world, the church was a major force in the Middle Ages, but its authority was shaken by the Black Death. The public witnessed priests dying in droves, and the church's inability to stop the plague led many to question their faith and the power of their leaders. This crisis of faith laid the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation. In a world without the plague, the church's power would be absolute and unquestioned. There would be no crisis of faith, and no popular movement to challenge its authority. The Protestant Reformation, fueled by a questioning populace and a newfound intellectual curiosity, would never happen. Europe would remain a single, monolithic, and deeply Catholic continent. The church would continue to be a dominant political force, controlling vast sums of wealth and wielding immense power over the lives of millions. Heresy would be ruthlessly suppressed, and new ideas, if they emerged, would be seen as a direct challenge to God's will. The very concept of religious freedom would be a foreign one. Part 4: The path to exploration and imperialism. The voyages of discovery, the journeys of men like Christopher Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan, were driven in part by a desire for wealth and power. In our world, the labor shortage created by the plague made it more profitable to look for new lands and new resources. The surplus population of a plague-less Europe would have no such incentive. With an abundance of cheap labor at home, the motivation to seek new continents would be greatly diminished. The drive for exploration would be a slow, gradual process, not a mad dash for new lands. This could mean that the Americas and Africa would not be colonized in the same way. The Aztec and Inca empires would have centuries more to evolve and prepare for contact with the outside world. The peoples of North America would not be displaced by a massive influx of settlers. The global trade routes would still exist, but they would be managed by powerful land-based empires, not by navies and colonizers. The world's wealth would not be concentrated in Europe but would be more evenly distributed across the globe. Part 5, a different global economy and a slower industrial revolution. The plague was a great economic equalizer. It created a middle class, a new class of merchants and artisans who, with their newfound wealth, began to challenge the old order. In a world without the plague, the old economic system of feudalism would persist. There would be no middle class, no new class of entrepreneurs, and no widespread urbanization. The vast majority of the population would remain in the countryside, tied to the land and subservient to a feudal lord. The Industrial Revolution, which was fueled by an educated, urbanized workforce and a new class of investors, would be delayed, if it happened at all. The new technologies of the 18th and 19th centuries would be seen as a threat to the social order. The old system, based on manual labor and agrarian societies, would be too entrenched to change. The world would remain a place of horses and carriages, of handcrafted goods, and of a rigid social hierarchy. The modern world, with its factories, its technology, and its rapid pace of change, would never come to pass. The final reckoning, a world of stagnation. So, in the end, what if the plague never happened? It is tempting to think of this as a utopia, a world without a great dying. But the reality would be far more complex and far more terrifying. It would be a world of immense population, but one of immense suffering. A world of a stagnant culture, of a rigid social order, and of a lack of hope. The plague, in our timeline, was a great destroyer, but it was also a great creator. It destroyed the old world and in its wake, created the conditions for a new one. It was a brutal reset button that, in the long run, led to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the foundations of the modern world. Without it, humanity might have been trapped forever in a kind of eternal Middle Ages, a world of beautiful cathedrals, but a world without a soul. The what-ifs are endless. We've explored a world without the Black Death, but what other natural disaster do you think has had the greatest impact on human history? Would you prefer to live in a world without the plague, even with all its drawbacks? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to keep exploring how our world could be different, be sure to like this video, subscribe to Timeline Shift, and get ready for our next adventure.